Bedouin Press presents 7 and 7, a globe-hopping memoir of disaster and discovery, written by Sven Michael Davison and performed by Sven Michael Davison. Continent 6, Africa, Morocco, September 13th through 16th, 2007. Why is there no home address? The dark uniformed customs agent waved my open passport in the air, flicking his finger at the blank portion. It is a law, yes? Sorry about that. I filled out the information in front of him, handed him back my document, and he made a Moroccan entry appear with pounding force on his stamp. I now had permission to enter the Casablanca terminal and find Janine. Janine and I had known each other through business since 1999, having lunch together as vendor and client a few times a year. When we first met, I thought she was out of my league. I started at Fox as a temp, and she was a general manager at Panasonic. By the time I made vice president, I felt more like her equal. But at a lunch around Christmas of 2005, she announced she was quitting her job, getting married, and helping her would-be husband start a restaurant. Another good one drops off the grid, I remarked to myself. In the spring of 2007, a mutual friend hosted a small dinner party for anyone who had been to Antarctica. I brought my photo album and spent the evening comparing notes with Janine. It turned out that she had been to Antarctica on the Molchanov in December of 1999. I also discovered her fiancé had called off the marriage 1 week before their wedding, and she was single again. Wheels began to turn inside my head. By this point in my life, I had spent the past 18 months online dating with no real success, and years committing to women who, it seemed, couldn't bring themselves to commit to me. Janine and I met up for dinner on Father's Day, and we discussed everything, including travel. The prior spring, she had taken a trip to Alaska to go kayaking. She'd been alone in a group of fellow travelers whom she had never met before the trip. I ticked several boxes in the thumbs-up column in my brain. Can travel alone, likes adventure, likes kayaking, likes camping. Then she went on. I was sleeping alone in my tent and I woke up because I needed to go pee. As I was getting out of my sleeping bag, I heard a bear shuffling around outside. I waited a few minutes, but the bear wouldn't go away. So I grabbed my waterproof hiking boot and peed in it. I smiled at the image of Janine stuck in a tiny nylon tent, unable to stand, with 700 pounds of grizzly outside. Most of the women I had dated in the past would have called it quits on camping forever. I wondered if any of them would have had the presence of mind to think of peeing in their boot. What did you do with the boot? I asked. I went back to bed, she shrugged. In the morning I emptied the boot, washed it out in the river, and wore it for the rest of the trip. Holy crap, I could marry this woman. That was our official first date. By August, Janine was living in Rabat, Morocco's capital. She had taken 6 weeks off from work to volunteer her services to Moroccan charities through an organization called Cross-Cultural Solutions. I missed her sorely, but we communicated daily by email and chatted on the phone once a week. She'd been assigned to an orphanage. All the volunteers and the nurses took care of the infants who arrived there. They'd change them, feed them, play with them, and hope that someone would come and adopt them. When I entered the terminal, I spotted Janine sitting on a hard plastic chair reading a book. She wore long, baggy khaki pants and a loose blue cotton shirt to cover her body. She was very cognizant of the customs in Muslim countries, and it drove her crazy to see European women showing legs and cleavage. We both agreed that when you travel, you are a guest and should respect local customs and laws. People who do not respect local customs are the same as strangers who enter your house and begin treating the place as their own. Because of this shared sensibility, Janine and I always did our research before traveling to learn about customs in the countries we visited. It had been a month since we had seen each other. We found a less public place to share a long kiss. Public displays of affection are frowned upon in Morocco. Then waited for our flight to Ouarzazate, a town on the northern edge of the Sahara Desert. The plane we took to Ouarzazate was straight out of an Indiana Jones film, a twin prop with the fuselage slung under the wing. It was boxy and looked more like an amphibious plane, but I didn't see any pontoons or a boat-like underbelly. The aircraft was incredibly loud and vibrated like a giant epilady, enough that my complimentary Diet Coke kept vibrating toward the edge of my tray table. We landed in Ouarzazate an hour before sunset. The town was very small, and the airport was a single 1,000-square-foot terminal next to a few Quonset huts and a lone runway. 2 taxis waited beyond a fence that hemmed in the airport. Janine addressed one of the drivers in French, and we were taken to the town's tourist center. Most of the buildings were red or pink. Most of the roads were dirt. The soil was full of iron. which was the reason everything had a reddish-pink tint. When we found paved roads, they were impregnated with the same color. We stopped at the tour office where Janine had reserved a guide to take us into the desert, where we'd camp out for a night and then ride camels the next day. Janine had created our entire itinerary. During her weekends, she traveled to different cities in Morocco with her fellow volunteer and roommate, so she knew the lay of the land. Once we had confirmed our Sahara travels, we took a cab to our hotel. The streets were deserted. When we entered the hotel, we heard almost no sounds. The place seemed empty. "This is so strange," Janine observed. "This is the first weekend of Ramadan, so everyone is fasting and staying with family. In the past month, every place has been crowded. You're not really seeing the country as it usually is." I'm fine with it. I'm not big on crowds, and getting a chance to see Morocco in rare form is a special treat. The next morning, I was awoken by the local mosque's call to prayer. The sky was black and blue from the sun trying to push its way up into the new day. I gazed outside and saw silhouettes of palm trees and onion domes. I felt like I was truly in an exotic place. At 7:30, our desert guides, Abdul and Baruch, picked us up in a little Toyota SUV that you could not buy in the United States. We headed south into the Sahara. Around noon, we stopped at a tiny town where the streets were completely lifeless. All of the buildings were 2 stories tall, made of adobe, and had wooden shutters. Everyone was indoors and fasting for Ramadan, so our guides needed to buy dinner for us. They drove up and down the streets for several minutes, stopping to knock on unmarked doors and getting no answer. On their 4th and last attempt, the door opened. The windows of this building had 4-foot-tall shutters that were open to the elements. I could see a bloody side of beef hanging from a hook and a chain inside. The meat was home to a mass of crawling flies. The man who had answered the door was dressed in a peach thob and wore a matching fez on his head. He grabbed some newspaper, swatted away the flies, and cut off a hunk of meat. He wrapped it up and gave it to Baruch. "Don't worry," Janine patted my hand when she saw me staring slack-jawed at our future dinner. "I'm sure they'll cook anything bad right out of it. Tagine is quite good here." "Yeah, and maggots are full of protein to boot." We arrived at the Sahara campsite at dusk, a ring of Bedouin tents surrounded by 100-foot sand dunes. The tents were substantial wooden frame structures wrapped in a dark brown burlap. Each tent could hold 12 sleeping people, provided no one moved. The wind picked up and whipped sand everywhere. We had purchased some hijab, traditional head coverings, earlier in the day, and Abdul and Baruch showed us how to put them on. We wrapped our heads, put on sunglasses, and headed into the windy dunes. Visibility was poor to non-existent at times, but we did glimpse a sand-veiled sunset over one of the most famous deserts in the world. The moment the sun dropped below the horizon, the wind stopped instantly. When we returned to camp, it was pitch black. The sky was clear and the stars blinked at us from above. Abdul and Baruch had made a fire, before which they sat dicing meat cubes and potatoes to cook in a large clay tagine. The camp was empty except for one skinny, lightly bearded American in his 20s named Alex. Alex had booked an entire week at the camp and was heading further into the desert in the morning. His guide had left before dinner to grab more supplies and would return in the morning. Our hosts had us sit inside a communal tent filled with rugs and large pillows. Our only light source was the fire about 10 feet outside the tent. As I reclined on some pillows, wearing my hijab, I felt like a true Bedouin. Abdul came by with heavy earthenware plates laden with rice and topped with beef tagine. When I bit into my beef, I saw what looked like fat grains of rice ooze out of the meat. I showed one to Janine. "Maggot." "At least it's cooked. If you sit further from the fire, you can't even see them." "Good point." I removed myself from the light and didn't worry about what I was eating. After dinner, we wandered back to our tent using some flashlights we had packed. The sky was black velvet, and the stars were so thick I felt like I could run my hands through them like water. Our tent was just as exotic as the one we had eaten in, but instead of big pillows, it contained a couple of stained futons. I was a tad worried about scorpions, which I had encountered a few times while visiting the wilds of Arizona. I looked up at the burlap roof and turned to Janine. "When was the last time you slept under the stars in the Sahara Desert?" Can't say as I ever have." "Then I say we don't waste this opportunity." We dragged the cleanest of the futons out behind our tent so we could have some privacy from the main circle. All the tent entrances faced inward, so anyone could see you coming or going. We spooned under our blankets and fell asleep under the blazing stars. I awoke snuggled next to Janine with a layer of dew on our blanket. An orange glow created sand dune silhouettes to the east. I nudged Janine. Want to see the sunrise over the Sahara? Is the Pope Catholic? We got dressed and headed into the dunes. The sky was absent of all clouds, and the dunes were absent of footprints. The camp was still. I felt like Janine and I were the only ones on the entire planet. As we summited the first dune, I spotted strange markings in the sand. There was a pencil-wide line with continuous oval dots on either side of it. It looked as if someone had used a roller with a necklace glued to the outside to create the impression, except there were no other tracks in sight. We both speculated on what would make such a track. Bird? Snake? Bug? When we crested the next dune, I spotted the culprit. A dusty black insect about the size of a cigarette lighter. Its thorax dragged in the sand, and its legs made the oval dots as it crawled along, leaving behind the strange trail. We reached the top of a tall dune, sat down, and admired the view. To the south was an endless ocean of dunes and the Algerian border. To the north was a mountain range. Upon closer scrutiny, we could just make out the village where Abdul and Baruch had purchased our dinner. The mountains stretched to the east, where the sun blazed in all its glory, poised to breathe fire into every grain of sand around us. It was time to head back. We had breakfast in the camp with our guides, but Alex was not awake for the festivities. After packing up our bags, we piled back into the Toyota and went for a ride in the sand dunes. It was a lot of fun for the first 10 minutes. Then we got stuck. It was only 9 o'clock, but the sun was already intense. We had no GPS, no radio, and no cell phone signal. I suddenly felt like a dumb teenager. Our guides, seemingly unfazed, pulled boards from the back of the little car and began to dig around the wheels. They wedged the wood under the tires to create traction. I helped with the digging while Janine hiked up a short ridge to take some photos of us. 15 minutes later, we were free. Janine and I cheered until Abdul stopped 20 feet ahead to retrieve his wood. My heart filled with dread, thinking that momentum was the key to keep from sinking in the sand. After returning with his boards, Abdul gunned the Toyota, which spun out for a few seconds before gripping into the dry stream bed he had parked on. We were on our way back to town. Our next stop was a large tent, much like the ones we had seen in camp, only there were a dozen camels, all of the one hump variety, tied around it. A young man in a blue thob and robe and a bright orange hijab came over to greet us. Baruch paid the man with dirhams. We had prepaid for the entire excursion the day before at the tourist center. The orange hijab man untied 2 camels and led them to us. He pulled the camels down on their knees so we could climb onto the saddles strapped to the front sides of each animal's hump. It was a very precarious spot to sit, even wobblier than riding a horse. Orange hijab took us over several dunes. Wherever we traveled down slope, I felt like I was about to pitch forward onto my camel's thin pencil neck. To compensate, I leaned far back in my saddle. It was hard to fathom that this had been the main mode of transportation in the area for the past few thousand years, but it did beat walking. When we returned to Camel Junction, we found Baruch and Abdul sleeping in the car under a beating hot sun. I was surprised they did not sleep in the shade of Orange Hijab's tent. Once again, I noticed we were the only ones in the entire area. Traveling during Ramadan certainly made me feel like I was the only tourist on the planet. We had hired Baruch and Abdul to take us into the Atlas Mountains to the town of Ayit Ben Hadou, where a portion of Gladiator had been filmed back in 1999. On the way, we passed a few watchtowers that had been built in the 7th century along the Silk Road, the largest trading route, both economically and physically in the world at that time. The towers were substantial stone structures that rose more than 3 stories high. They were built as rest stops and had offered food and water. It was fun to imagine a time when people here were dressed in hijabs and thobs and driving caravans of a few hundred camels. They'd take a break in a tower for the night to rest up and refuel for the next day's ride. Janine had booked us at the Kasbah called Eloise. Traditional Kasbahs were a series of interconnected towers constructed of mud straw brick. Ours was a little more modern in that it had timber reinforcements, plumbing, and electricity. Yet everything here was the deep reddish brown of the mud it came from, making me feel like a good rainstorm would melt the entire Kasbah. At the Kasbah, I had the additional peace of mind of a private bathroom with an American-style porcelain toilet. This was extremely fortunate, since somehow I had fallen into the grips of persistent and explosive diarrhea. Some bug had settled into my intestines and it would not give up until I returned to the States and killed it with a run of Cipro. Until then, I had to live with the inconvenience. Baruch and Abdul departed after dropping us off at the Kasbah. Since we were in a very small town, there was nothing much to do outside of our accommodations. Janine and I ate dinner and breakfast at our hotel. This was fine with me, as my new issue kept me tied to the restroom. In between bathroom breaks, I went up on the roof and checked out the other Kasbahs surrounding ours. One of them was crumbling badly. It was odd to see people living in half-built rooms and occupying a place that in the States would have been condemned. The next morning, I spotted what looked like finches living in the eaves above our room. The place certainly felt more environmentally friendly than anything I had ever seen in America. As Janine got ready to leave, I sat on the balcony and photographed the village, preparing for a new day. Many villagers were undertaking a pilgrimage down a dusty slope to a well. Everyone carried large jugs and buckets to fill with water. A few carried 10-gallon drink coolers of the kind you saw being dumped over a coach's head after a football game. I got the feeling that this well was likely the only source of water for the area. After we checked out, the hotel owner drove us a couple miles to the taxi stand located in the center of town. Janine used her French again to ask for someone to drive us to Marrakesh. On her third attempt, she found a man willing and ready to drive us. It would cost us roughly $120. "That's pretty high," Janine commented to me, but I was told prices would jump during Ramadan since no one wants to work while fasting. "I'd say that's pretty cheap. I once paid that to get a cab from JFK to Montclair, New Jersey, and that's a 40-minute ride." The majority of the cabs in Morocco were vintage S-Class Mercedes from the 1970s in faded pastels of yellow and green. It was odd to see so many classic luxury cars used for public transportation. The drive took us up and over the Atlas Mountains. We spent most of the day in the back of the car with no air conditioning, and my stomach cramps intensified. We stopped several times so I could use the loo. "You sure you don't feel the least bit ill?" I asked Janine. "I mean, we've eaten all the same things." "I'm fine. I got sick when I first came here. I think I've built up a tolerance." En route, I noticed our driver snacking. Janine informed me that Morocco was one of the least conservative Muslim countries in the Arab world, and I witnessed a few more instances of people eating during the daytime on our trip. Everyone also drank water, though I should think that would be fine with the imams in a fiercely hot desert. We arrived in Marrakesh around 4 in the afternoon. Our hotel was not accessible by car, so we had to carry our luggage through the Jama El Fana, the main city square. Beyond the square, we hauled our bags down a road that was more of a narrow alley, accessible only by horse-drawn carts. Our hotel was a riad, a large multi-story home that was built out to the street. Its only outdoor space was a center courtyard and a rooftop that encircled the courtyard below. This riad was 4 stories tall and had many rooms with private baths. When we checked in, Janine had the presence of mind to ask for extra toilet paper. I spent most of the afternoon using the bathroom. We were on the second floor, and I had the bathroom window open. A few times I heard Janine laughing on the other side of the door. When I exited the bathroom, I asked, "What's so funny?" My stomach continued to make somersaults in my abdomen. "You're just so incredibly loud. Did you have the window open?" "Well, yeah, otherwise you'd need a biohazard suit to breathe in there." "Look out the window and see where we are." I entered the bathroom, stepped up to the window, and looked down. I was directly above the entrance to the hotel. I could see people walking around the street just below me. "Oh my!" I began to laugh too and went back into the room. Janine rubbed my back. "You've been providing the welcome fanfare for all those who enter here." "If they ask us to move rooms, I'll understand." They didn't ask, and since I was not feeling very well, we decided to check out the city from one of the many rooftop terrace restaurants situated around the Jama El Fana. Due to the season, we had no trouble finding a cafe table overlooking the entire square. I ordered sweet tea and some biscuits. Janine ordered a sandwich. I took a few bites of everything, but my stomach was having none of it. I had to visit the restaurant latrine. All the bathrooms in Mexico were fairly clean, but as in many countries, there was no toilet paper. Luckily, Janine had a few travel packs with her, but we were rapidly running out. After my evacuation round, I returned to our spot, rested one arm on the cafe wall to support my big camera lens, and shot the world inside the square. I found a man in a blue thob and red fez clanging on giant castanets. Janine spotted a waterman who sported a massive red floppy hat adorned with orange, green, and blue tuft tassels. He charged 5 dirhams for a drink of water poured into one of the brass cups attached to a chain around his neck. There were massive outdoor buffets where you could order a meal and literally sit at a table in the middle of the square and eat it. I watched a vendor pace around his dozen dried fruit carts with a horsetail switch. He constantly swatted at flies to keep them off his merchandise. As my lens traveled around, I kept focusing on the snake charmers situated in the center of the square. There were about 10 men who worked the snake baskets. A few of them wandered into the crowd and draped small snakes on smiling tourists. Then they'd ask for money in order to get a photo with the snake or with both the snake and the charmer. All the snake men worked from a center hub, where a man in his 40s dressed in a white thob and red fez sat on several Persian rugs. He pulled larger snakes from baskets, laid the snakes on the rug in front of him, and played music on his pungi, a snake charmer's musical gourd. One of the charmers, wearing an orange headband, played for a 4-foot cobra. His pungi had a large triangular end piece on it that was painted white. I noticed that the cobra seemed to follow the end of the pungi, making it look like it was swaying to the music. A young charmer wearing a purple t-shirt occasionally wandered by and hung over the older man's shoulder to watch the snakes and chat. I wondered if this might be the old man's son, learning his father's trade. I passed the camera to Janine a few times so she could share my telescopic view of the action. We stayed until the sun set over the square. A few dozen tables were set up near outdoor clay ovens and barbecues. As darkness swallowed the day, large streetlights reminiscent of the old gas lamps of Paris began to glow in the area of the tables, and the crowds grew with the night. Marrakesh was waking up. My stomach continued to churn, but I wanted to check out the famous souks off the square. We left our cafe and walked down the Rue Souk Samarine. We discovered that more than half of the storefronts were closed. I wondered if they would open at all during Ramadan. When I was here 2 weeks ago, these alleyways were packed with people. You could barely move, Janine marveled. That night it was Janine's turn to experience a run of diarrhea. She was more discreet than I had been, but any noise from our bathroom was also drowned out by the massive crowds below our window. During Ramadan, nighttime released everyone from their homes to feast and socialize. Better to sleep through the daylight fast than deal with the heat on an empty stomach. Work suffered during Ramadan, but that was the point. It was a holy month dedicated to Allah. The next morning, the Kutubiyya Mosque's loudspeakers crackled and popped with the call to prayer. I got dressed and went up to the rooftop terrace of our riad for breakfast. We planned to head out of the city soon. Most of the skyline was roughly 4 stories high except for the minarets of the Kutubiyya Mosque, and I saw hundreds of TV antennas sticking up from roofs like the remnants of some forest devastated by fire. I was reminded of a story I'd heard about the making of Raiders of the Lost Ark, during which a few weeks and several $1,000s were spent to temporarily take down all the TV antennas in Spielberg's shots of Cairo. Today, of course, Spielberg's team would simply use computers to erase anything that didn't fit into the 1930s mise-en-scène. We wheeled our luggage back through the square to the main parking area. Janine secured us a cab ride out to the ruins of El Badi Palace, because I love ruins and because there were nesting white storks there. When we reached the ruin, there were at most 3 other tourists in the whole site. The place was enormous and would have been quite a spectacle in its day. After waiting an hour for us to tour the ruins, our cabbie took us to the train station. From there we planned to head back to Rabat, where Janine had been living and where the majority of her luggage was still stored at the Center for Volunteer Workers. We splurged and purchased tickets for an air-conditioned compartment. We reached Rabat in the late afternoon, where once again the streets were all but deserted. "I can't believe this," Janine gazed around. "When I left, this was a bustling city. It was really crowded. You're not getting the feel for what it's really like here. It's like a bomb went off somewhere." "I think it's cool. Ramadan has made my visit sort of post-apocalyptic." We checked into our hotel. It was a few blocks from the train station on Avenue Mohammed V, where most of the municipal buildings were located in Rabat. Once we settled into our room, Janine made a phone call to the volunteer center to be sure she could pick up her luggage. One of the drivers from the center insisted on picking us up from the hotel rather than have us take a cab. The van swung by after nightfall. The air conditioning inside was heavenly. Unlike the previous night in Marrakesh, the streets remained deserted. The volunteer center was a large gated compound in a more suburban part of Rabat. The main building was 2 stories tall, with white tiled floors, Janine led me into a small room dominated by a stack of 3 bunks with just enough room to walk alongside them. This was where she had been living for the past month. The whole facility had the feel of a kibbutz. Janine introduced me to Rachel, who had worked with her at the orphanage and traveled with her on weekends. Rachel was from Britain and had been living and working in Madrid for the past 12 years. We had changed our return flight so we'd have a 24-hour layover in Madrid on the way back home, during which we'd stay a night at Rachel's flat in the heart of the city. "Any news on Akim?" Janine asked Rachel. "They were told about his condition," Rachel replied. "And?" "They're not sure." A tear welled up in Janine's eye. "How can you bond with that darling little boy for 3 weeks and not be sure?" "I know." There were few legal stipulations regarding the adoption of children in Morocco. First, you had to be a Muslim, and you were required to be interviewed by a local imam to prove that you were a true believer. Then you had to live in the country for at least a month to get to know your potential child. After these requirements had been met, you had to pay a large fee to the government. These restrictions severely limited the number of interested parents. And in addition to Morocco's adoption laws, there was a stigma in some Muslim circles about adopting and being adopted, which limited the number of interested parents even more. At the orphanage where Janine worked, if a child was not adopted in his or her first year, he or she was sent up to the second floor, where the older children lived. Unlike the first floor, there were no volunteers on the second floor, and little interaction with the staff nurses. The children were rarely seen or played with. Because of this, the ones who would bite or pull hair, or who were generally unruly, would get the most attention, if only in the form of discipline. Once children were sent to the second floor, their chances of being adopted significantly dropped. I wondered what kind of adults they would become, growing up in that type of environment. Janine had begun to bond emotionally with many of the infants. One boy in particular, Akim, was very sweet, and there was a couple interested in him. However, Akim had a respiratory problem, and Janine feared that when the would-be parents found out, they would abandon Akim for another, healthier infant boy. Akim was 11 months old and would not have time to wait for another interested couple to come along. This was his only chance to live in a loving home. If this couple did not adopt him, the rest of his life would start on the second floor on his first birthday. Janine had a hard time socializing after hearing the news. We were offered some dinner, but by this point she wanted to go. "Not sure is not a no," I said as I rubbed Janine's shoulders on the ride back to the hotel. She nodded. "No reason to be sad unless it's a definite no." As we returned to our hotel, the streets finally came alive, but the crowds were not as dense as they had been in Marrakesh. Then again, our hotel was not located in the city center either. The next morning we woke up early in order to be at the train station when the ticket window opened. Now that the sun was up, the streets were abandoned once again. We bought tickets to travel to Fez in another air-conditioned railway car. As soon as we sat down and showed our tickets to the conductor, a woman in a light green jalabia, a dress that covers the entire body, with matching hijab and niqab, entered our compartment. With the niqab covering her face, we could only see her deep brown eyes. "Bonjour," Janine smiled. The woman nodded, curled up on a padded seat across from us, and promptly fell asleep. The train rolled along through the desert countryside. Whenever we passed a river or a well, the landscape exploded with intense green, and then, as if Allah had cut the earth with a knife, the landscape was back to dry shades of dead brown. A few stops later, our cabin mate woke up and disembarked from the train. Janine and I were alone again, traveling in the desolation of Ramadan. Janine was generally very good about not obsessing on a subject, better than I, but her mind kept drifting to Akim. "I keep trying to figure out a way to adopt him. I just don't want to see that child sent to the second floor." "Well, you could stay for a few more months and convert to Islam." I was half serious. "I'm sure my Catholic mother would love that." "No, it's not practical. I need to get back and go to work." I tried to stay positive for her. "Hopefully the parents will be fine with Akim's condition and all will be well." "I hope you're right." Fez was really 2 cities in one. The center of Fez was a series of tall, thin, mud and brick buildings separated by meandering streets that were not wide enough to accept a car. When I walked down the avenues, there were no straight lines. Wherever I looked down a path, a tall building eventually blocked the route. The old city was constructed during medieval times and was contained by a massive wall that encircled the entire area. Outside the wall, the city was full of straight lines and urban sprawl, but when I passed inside the walls of Fez, I felt as if I had stepped 1,200 years back into history. I passed artisans who trained apprentices in how to create lace patterns in wood, a technique called inlay. There were people buying live chickens from vendors who used ancient scales to weigh the birds and determine their price. At one corner, I passed a half-dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10, all carrying buckets to fill at a public fountain so their families would have water for the day. Mangy stray cats and kittens darted about. Every street was of a different width. Some were wide enough to walk 10 abreast, others so thin I could barely squeeze through them sideways. I looked down one alley and saw an emaciated horse wandering about, its skin hanging off its bones. The poor animal turned its head in my direction. I don't think it even saw me. It reminded me of a ghost, searching for a way out of this endless purgatorial maze. We entered one courtyard where men hammered out huge copper kettles with wooden mallets. I did not see one power tool or motorized gadget anywhere in the old city, not even a cell phone. I did not see any plastic or brand names. At one point, we reached a section of the old city that smelled of pungent excrement. A small boy dressed in a dirty white thob approached us. "Do you want a guide to the dye pits?" "Sure," Janine answered. The kid looked to be about 8. He led us down a few alleys to a thin stairwell. After following him up 4 stories, we entered a very large shop that was filled with leather goods. The place reeked of feces, but under the stench I could smell treated leather. At the back of the store was one large balcony letting in natural light. "Here's 20 dirhams. I held out the money. He shook his head. "American." I felt around my front pocket. I had a 5 and gave it to him. A big smile spread over his face. "Thank you," he said, and with that he disappeared. A large balding man with a thick black mustache dressed in a red and white striped thob approached us. 20 dirhams each to see dye pits. If you buy something, I will refund the money." I paid the man and looked around the shop, but didn't see anything I wanted or needed. Janine and I wandered to the balcony in the back. We gazed down upon a massive open courtyard about the size of a football field. The ground was laid out in a haphazard grid. Inside each grid square was a circular pit about 3 feet in diameter. The pits were grouped by color. One section was blue, another red, another yellow, another white. The smell was intense. "We use the ways of old," the merchant informed us. "We get color from minerals, and we fix the dye with bird feces and bull urine." That explained the pungent odor. Down below, men worked the dye pits. They wore nothing but loincloths as they submerged entire cowhides into the color liquid with large wooden staffs. The hide was pushed down to the bottom and allowed to soak for a set amount of time. Once the hide was ready, the men slipped into the dye pit to retrieve it. This action meant each man was color-coded from the shoulders down. I thought it must take a special woman to be married to a dye pit worker. Janine planned on us spending only a few hours in Fez. Then we'd catch a cab to the ancient Roman city of Volubilis, eat lunch, explore the ruins for a couple hours, then hire a cab back to Rabat. As we exited the old city through its north gate, I was sad to leave. Fez was by far my favorite Moroccan city yet. I was absolutely stunned by how many people lived without a single modern convenience. "I've heard they have a lot of strict rules in place to keep it that way," Janine commented when I expressed my appreciation for Fez. "Anyone living and working inside the walls must do so without modern technology because tourism is their #1 source of income. Somehow that makes it less romantic. Nicer to think it's a lifestyle decision rather than an economical one. Think of it as both." The north gate was stuffed with cabs. I confirmed with a nod of my head. Janine addressed the drivers in French to ask if they would take us to Volubilis and all the way back to Rabat. Several said no, but one man in a white thob and hijab asked if we'd be in Rabat by sundown. He wanted to get to a mosque to end his day of fasting. Janine checked her watch. "Do you think we can stick to no more than 2 hours in Volubilis?" "Sure," I replied. The driver quoted us 700 dirhams, or about $200, for the entire trip. It took just under an hour to reach the ancient Roman ruin built on a hilltop. Most of the buildings were gone, but many of the indoor tiled floor mosaics were still intact. The largest structure was a triumphal arch, nothing like the ones in Rome, but still an impressive structure. We had been in the ruin for about 15 minutes when Janine turned to me and said, "I need to go to the bathroom. Why don't you stay and take photos, and I'll meet you around here in 15 minutes. "I'll come with you." "No, we don't have much time, and I know you want to take photos." She pointed down the hill. There was a trail to the bathrooms. "It's not far." "Okay." Janine gave me a kiss and left. I snapped a few photos while my mind began to churn. Was this a test? Was she really saying, "Do you love your photos more than me?" A real man would not have agreed so easily. I gazed down the gentle slope towards the gated entrance to the ruin. I heard the voices of ex-girlfriends, Gudrun, Chloe, and others before them in my head. When a girl says one thing, she really means another. It's how we communicate. You're being selfish. My paranoia spiked. I should go down and meet her. There were a few trails down to the bathroom. I could not see her on the short path. Surely she must be done by now. Maybe she took the long path to give me more time. I jogged the long path. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and it was brutally hot. Sweat ran down my face. The short path and the bathroom fell out of sight. Ugh, what if I miss her? This is stupid. I pressed harder. I reached the gate and the bathrooms and saw no sign of her. Sweat stung my eyes. I looked up the hill. Nothing. I walked out of the ruins and checked our cab. Our driver was sound asleep behind the wheel. A memory of getting mugged with my date back in my NYU days entered my mind. We had both been hit and separated in the process. During what seemed like a lifetime, I thought of rape and murder. It only took about 5 minutes before I found my date again, but it felt like an eternity. We both wound up bruised but safe. My anxiety heightened. I thought, my God, what if she was kidnapped? I tore back up the hill. As the blood and adrenaline pounded through my brain, I began to think I was becoming irrational. What if we just missed each other? I reached the area where we were supposed to rendezvous. Nothing. I pressed forward, panting and sweating in the heat. I saw 2 people up ahead, but neither was Janine. Did she reach the other side of the ruins and then go back to the cafe? Maybe she reached the cafe and had been kidnapped. I searched for Janine under the hot sun with the NYU mugging episode refreshed in my mind. What if she was killed? Slow down, you're being irrational. I decided to head back to the cafe again. A half hour had passed, and I didn't see her anywhere. Then I heard a whistle blowing. I spun around and searched the ruin for the source. Maybe she was in trouble, and someone had found her. I ran toward the sound, which was coming up from the main path. I reached a flat area and spotted the highest point of the ruins, where I saw Janine standing next to a security guard who was blowing his whistle. I wanted to throw up. Had something bad happened? When Janine spotted me, she turned to the guard and he put his whistle away. He headed down the hill as I ran up it, panting and sweating. "What happened?" she asked. "That's my question," I gasped. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. But after a half hour, I searched for a security guard to help me find you. It was his idea to come up here and blow the whistle." "So you're fine? Nothing happened?" My concern was turned to anger. "I'm fine." "That's just great," I said with annoyance. Now she was angry. "I didn't do anything except walk as slow as possible up the short path and through the ruins, just like we agreed." "I waited, but then I thought you might be testing me, so I went down to the bathrooms. We must have missed each other during that time. When I couldn't find you around the gate area, I panicked and began searching all over. We didn't talk about where to meet beyond the ruins back there. Sounds like you assumed a lot." Her voice was laced with irritation. I was pissed that she was annoyed with me. "I was worried. I thought maybe you had been abducted or something." "That's ridiculous. There's no one here. It's perfectly safe. I've traveled the world. I can handle myself." "Where the hell were you?" My anger escalated with hers. "Where I said I'd be, in the bathroom, then the area where I had left you. You were supposed to wait. I figured you just spaced out with your camera and wandered ahead." "Well, I lost track of time, and since this place is Ramadan empty and I didn't see you anywhere, I assumed the worst." I was beginning to feel like a fool. "I'm sorry, my confusion." Apology accepted. We walked on, but both of us remained angry. I was mad because I thought she should apologize for the confusion. She was mad at me for being an idiot. It wasn't until we got back into the taxi and we were headed to Rabat that I decided to come clean with regard to my behavior. If Janine was playing mind games with me, or was going to throw this back in my face, We'd simply break up, and I'd have another uncomfortable vacation like I had with Gudrun in Singapore. But I did not want to be with anyone I could not openly communicate with about any and all subjects. I cleared my throat. I'm still mad at you. I know I shouldn't be, because I'm the one who panicked, but I've had a lot of girlfriends test me in the past. They say one thing, but they do another. I thought this was like that. And then, when I didn't find you, I thought something terrible had happened. She held my hand and spoke with compassion. Thank you for being open with me, but please remember that I always mean what I say, and I do what I say. I don't play games. I'm too old for that. She laughed. If we had dated 20 years ago, I would have been one of those girls, but not now. So will you promise me that? Promise you what? That you'll take me at my word? I promise. I kissed her. I didn't care if it might make our driver uncomfortable. I felt much better, and I realized that Janine and I could fight and then be fine. The heat was stifling, but we had all 4 windows rolled down, and our driver was speeding maniacally along the narrow roads to beat sundown. We had left a half hour late, and he wanted to make it back to a mosque. We drove past cities and towns, racing toward the seaside city of Rabat. When the sun touched the horizon, our driver pulled over, grabbed his prayer rug, and ran a few yards into the desert so he could pray toward Mecca. As we watched him bow and chant, Janine said, "Oh man, I feel so bad. He was the only one who said yes, but I could tell he was nervous about being out on the road at sunset. Now here we are. I'm going to give him a double tip and apologize." I agreed that we definitely owed him. The sky turned into a deep purple-black bruise by the time we pulled up to our hotel. Janine tipped our driver and apologized profusely. He said it was okay. Then he took off onto a deserted street, and we decided to take a walk so I could photograph the streets of Rabat at night. Many times I lay in the middle of the road to get a shot of a lit-up mosque or the shooting star decorations attached to the lampposts. I never saw a car, so I never felt any danger of being run over. We went to bed before the city woke up for its nightly feasting. The next morning we got up before dawn so we could watch the sun rise in the Rabat Medina sector of the city. The buildings there were all painted white with blue trim. The area felt more like a movie set than a real place. I photographed the harbor and the empty souks. When it got late enough in the morning, Janine called Rachel to find out about Akeem. The parents, it turned out, were leaving town and planned on coming back to find another child at some later date. Akeem had only a few weeks left of one-on-one attention before he'd be sent to the second floor. There was not enough time for a family to come, visit him for 4 weeks, and then adopt him. His chances of being spared a life of neglect and negative attention were now essentially 0. When she got off the phone, Janine broke down crying. "You can stay. You can convert," I suggested. "I can't. It's not practical. And yet I feel so selfish. There has to be a way to adopt him. Converting is not that easy, and I'd only be doing it to adopt him." We talked for a while, but Janine wanted the comfort of her own family. She called her sister and her mother back in the States. They both sympathized, but there was nothing realistic she could do. The same scenario was happening to thousands of kids all over Morocco. I was frustrated and angry at the system. For me, religion is a guide to help people live their life and treat others with respect. Most of all, religion helps people tend their souls. Why should a child suffer because there aren't enough people of a certain faith to adopt him or her? All children are created equal, and so are faiths, as long as their scripture does not promote harming others. Who cares if the child grows up to be a Hindu, Muslim, Jew, Buddhist, Christian, or atheist? A child should experience giving and receiving love. A child should learn to respect others and to contribute to the betterment of humanity instead of the subjugation of others. Any child who learns and experiences these things is getting the best education on the planet. That afternoon, we took a cab to the international airport to board a flight to Madrid. Rachel had flown back the day before so she could start work again. We stayed in her flat that night, and the next morning she gave us a quick tour of the city before we had to catch our flights back to the States. I flew back to Los Angeles so I could return to my job. Janine flew to Minnesota to be with her family for a week before she, too, had to return to LA and resume her routine. We never learned what happened to Akeem or the rest of the children on the second floor. 7 months later, I proposed to Janine.